So, in 1981, there was this man who got caught in a public park in Paris.
Right, the Bois de Boulogne.
Yeah, exactly. And he's standing there with two suitcases. And inside these suitcases are the dismembered remains of this really brilliant young woman.
It's incredibly grim.
It really is. And when the police eventually raid his apartment, they find the rest of her, like, in his refrigerator.
Yeah, the evidence was just completely undeniable.
Oh, totally. I mean, he offered a full confession, like, immediately. He even handed over photographs that he took himself to, document the crime.
He basically built the prosecution's case for them.
Exactly. There's zero doubt of his guilt. The evidence is overwhelming. The confession is pristine. And you'd really think, okay, the cell door is about to slam shut on this guy for the rest of his natural life.
Right. You would assume that's how the justice system works.
Right. And this is the part that is just so hard to wrap your head around. Just 5 years later, this exact same man didn't just walk out of a hospital in Tokyo as a totally free man.
No, he really didn't.
No, he walked straight into like a super lucrative career. He became a celebrity author. He was a talk show guest. And I am not kidding you, a national restaurant critic.
I know, it sounds like some kind of dystopian fiction, right? Like a bad movie plot.
It totally does.
But it's actually one of the most meticulously documented failures of international justice in modern history.
Which is wild. So welcome to this deep dive. Today we are taking you into the case of Issei Sagawa.
The media usually dubbed him the Paris Cannibal, or sometimes the Kobe Cannibal.
Right, the Kobe Cannibal. And to figure out how a confessed murderer becomes this weird pop culture icon, we're basically piecing together this massive mosaic of information for you.
Yeah, we have a really interesting stack of sources for this one.
We do.
Yeah.
We're cross-referencing original international news reports from the 1980s with these retrospective analyses from places like Japan Today, Arab News.
And we're also layering in some academic journals, right?
Yeah, exactly. Academic journals on media exploitation, plus some public commentary forums. And when you put all of that together, a really terrifying picture emerges.
It's terrifying, I think, mostly because it isn't just about a single violent act.
No, not
It's more like an autopsy of how multiple supposedly highly advanced systems, medical, legal, and the media, how they can all just simultaneously collapse.
And when they collapse, they basically create this impenetrable shield for a predator.
Exactly.
So, okay, let's unpack this. That is the mission of this deep dive. We aren't here to just recount a gruesome murder.
No, because honestly, that's just the cheapest form of true crime.
Right, and it completely misses the actual story. We want to unpack the mechanics of this profound legal paradox.
We're exploring the very specific, bizarre psychology of deadly obsession, too.
Yeah, and we're looking at the uncomfortable reality of a society that actually decided to feed a monster's ego, like by buying his books and watching his movies.
It really forces you to look at media consumption, doesn't it?
It really does. So we're going to spend the next bit of time giving you a super comprehensive, detailed exploration of the how and the why behind the Sagawa case.
Because, if we don't understand the mechanisms that allowed him to walk free, we just remain entirely blind to the vulnerabilities that still exist in our justice systems today.
Exactly. We have to know how it broke down. So let's start at the very beginning. To understand how Sagawa navigated the aftermath of his crime, you really have to understand the immense power he was born into.
Right. The family background is crucial here.
It's everything. Issei Sagawa was born in Kobe, Japan in 1949. And we are talking about extreme, top-tier wealth and privilege.
Yeah, his father, Akira Sagawa, wasn't just some middle management businessman.
No, he was this highly influential executive. He eventually became the president of Kurita Water Industries.
And his grandfather was an editor for a massive newspaper too, right? The Asahi Shimbun.
Yeah, the Asahi Shimbun. So this is a family that operates with the kind of influence that literally bends rules.
The wealth is really the foundational layer of this entire narrative. It provided him with access, with mobility, and, eventually a manufactured innocence.
But what's so crucial here, from the sources, is the extreme contrast between the family's monumental societal power and Issei Sagawa's actual physical reality.
Right, from the moment he drew his first breath, essentially.
Yeah, he was born severely premature. The sources actually say he was literally small enough to fit in the palm of his father's hand.
Wow, yes, and immediately after birth, he contracted enteritis.
Which is an inflammation of the small intestine, right?
Exactly, a severe life-threatening inflammation. So his early weeks were spent in this incredibly fragile state.
He was barely hanging on.
Right. He was kept alive through these rigorous medical interventions, like constant injections of potassium and calcium mixed with saline.
Wow, just to keep a newborn alive.
Yeah, and he survived, obviously, but that extreme physical vulnerability basically became permanent.
Right, he didn't really grow out of it. He grew into an adult who stood under 5 feet tall.
Mhm.
I think the sources said about 145 centimeters.
That's right. And he was perpetually frail. He had a very high-pitched voice.
And mentally, he viewed himself as deeply ugly and just entirely weak.
So you have to imagine the psychology there, right?
Oh, it's a powder keg. You're the firstborn son of an incredibly powerful patriarch in post-war Japan.
Right. A culture and an era that heavily prioritized strength, corporate dominance, and, legacy.
Totally. So on paper, you have the world at your feet. But in the mirror, you see someone who feels entirely powerless.
And according to the historical profiles we looked at, this inferiority complex metastasized very early on into some incredibly dark urges.
Like terrifyingly early. He later admitted that his first conscious experiences of cannibalistic desires happened when he was just in the first grade.
In the first grade, it's chilling.
Yeah, he recalled seeing a man's thigh and feeling this distinct, overwhelming compulsion to consume it.
And as he grew older, this pathology just deepened.
It escalated.
It did. He engaged in bestiality with his dog. He became obsessed with fairy tales that featured cannibalistic witches or monsters.
But the weird part is, he didn't find them scary.
No, rather than finding them to be, like, frightening cautionary tales, he identified with the monsters.
He wanted to be the monster.
Exactly. He internalized this idea of consumption as a form of power.
And this wasn't just him, like, sitting in a dark room having weird thoughts. The sources detail a major incident in 1972, which is long before the murder in Paris.
Right, he's in his early 20s at this point.
Yeah, he's attending Waco University in Tokyo. And he actually acts on these urges. He fixates on this tall German woman, follows her home, and literally breaks into her apartment while she's sleeping.
And his intention, which he didn't admit until much later, was to cut off a piece of her flesh to eat.
Which is horrifying. But fortunately, she woke up.
She did. She fought back, and she physically overpowered him.
Which, given his stature, probably wasn't terribly difficult.
Right. She shoved him to the ground, the police were called, and he was arrested.
But this is the critical juncture, I think. He gets caught in the apartment of a sleeping woman. But he doesn't tell the police, hey, I wanted to eat her.
No, of course not.
So he gets charged with attempted rape. And then, surprise, surprise, the family wealth activates.
Akira Sagawa steps in.
Yep. The dad pays whatever needs to be paid, pulls whatever strings need to be pulled, and the charges just vanish.
It is a textbook example of a missed intervention. The legal system just allows a wealthy family to buy their way out of a consequence.
Exactly. But from a behavioral psychology standpoint, the lesson that Issei Sagawa learns here is catastrophic.
It's pure operant conditioning. He learns that his actions, no matter how predatory they are, they just don't have permanent consequences.
Right. His family's money is basically a magic erasure. But wait, it gets even more egregious. I found this detail in the academic profiles absolutely staggering.
Oh, about the psychiatrist.
Yes. Around this time, he actually voluntarily goes to a psychiatrist and confesses these cannibalistic urges.
Right.
He tells a medical professional, quote, I want to eat human flesh. The psychiatrist realizes, okay, this guy is incredibly dangerous. And what happens?
The father intervenes again.
Unbelievable.
Because institutionalizing his son would be a stain on the family's immaculate corporate and social reputation.
God forbid the neighbors talk, right?
Exactly. So instead of securing the intensive psychiatric confinement that Sagawa desperately needed, the father engineers a cover-up.
He decides the best course of action is to just simply relocate the problem.
Right, send him abroad to study.
It's enraging. They basically exported a ticking time bomb to Europe just to protect the family name. So in 1977, at 28 years old, Sagawa arrives in Paris.
He's there to pursue a PhD in literature at the Sorbonne.
And once he's there, his obsession narrows into this laser focus. He becomes entirely fixated on tall, healthy, white European women.
He explicitly states his belief that by consuming them, he could, quote, absorb their energy.
And I want to dig into that. To understand the mechanics of this obsession, the case files reference some specific psychological literature, right?
Yes, specifically the work of Richard von Krafft-Ebing and his foundational 19th century text, Psychopathia Sexualis.
Okay, break that down for us.
So, Krafft-Ebing categorized a vast array of sexual deviations, and what Sagawa exhibited falls under a rare and extreme paraphilia related to zoophagia.
I really want to stop you there because I think people hear the word zoophagia and they assume it just means eating animals or like eating live things.
Right. The prefix zoo usually points to that in common language.
Exactly. So break down how that term specifically applies to a human-on-human crime in the psychological context.
Certainly. So, in everyday language, cannibalism is usually driven by one of three things, right?
Sure.
Extreme starvation, like the Donner Party,
Sure.
or ritualistic or cultural practices seen in antiquity,
Yeah.
or just sheer chaotic, sadistic violence.
Okay.
But zoophagia, when it's applied as a psychosexual pathology, is fundamentally about incorporation. Right. The driving force is this delusion that by consuming a living entity, you physically and spiritually possess its attributes.
Oh, wow. It's like ancient sympathetic magic.
Exactly.
The myth that if you eat the heart of a brave warrior, you gain his courage.
Precisely. But Sagawa's version of this was an eroticized, deeply pathetic manifestation of that concept.
He didn't want courage.
No, he wanted vitality. He looked at his own body, stunted, frail, sickly, and he felt immense self-loathing.
So when he looked at these tall, vibrant, educated European women, he saw the physical manifestation of literally everything he was denied.
Right. His desire to consume them wasn't primarily about destroying them, as backwards as that sounds. It was a profoundly delusional attempt to ingest their superiority.
To assimilate their health and their stature into his own deficient biology.
Exactly.
That is, I mean, he felt like he was nothing, so he wanted to physically swallow a something to become a something.
That's a very accurate way to put it.
And that terrifying logic leads us directly to Renée Hartevelt. She was a 25-year-old Dutch student, also studying at the Sorbonne.
And by all accounts, she was brilliant.
She really was.
Yeah.
She spoke 3 languages, she was super independent, and she was working toward her own PhD.
And physically, she was 5 feet 10 inches tall.
Right, which is a full foot taller than Sagawa. She was the absolute embodiment of his obsession.
And Sagawa approached this with methodical precision.
He didn't just stumble into this.
Not at all. He used his primary asset, which was his wealth. He approached her under the guise of needing a German tutor.
And he paid her a highly inflated rate, right? Just to ensure she would actually spend time with him.
Yes, he made it very financially beneficial for her. And then he began this campaign of integration.
He invited her out.
Right, to concerts, to expensive dinners, to art exhibits. He was basically attempting to court her. He was writing her these intense love letters and eventually propositioning her sexually.
And she shut it down completely.
Completely.
She made it unequivocally clear that she was committed to someone else, she was not attracted to him, and their relationship was strictly a platonic, professional arrangement.
Which shattered the fantasy.
Right.
For a narcissist harboring a deep-seated inferiority complex, that kind of absolute rejection is intolerable.
It must have just completely reaffirmed his deepest fears about his own inadequacy.
It did. And since he could not possess her through conventional means, he resolved to possess her through his ultimate fantasy.
Which brings us to the evening of June 11th, 1981. Sagawa invites Renée to his apartment at 10 Rue Erlanger.
And the pretense for this visit is incredibly specific.
It is. He tells her he needs her to record herself reading German expressionist poetry for a literature assignment.
So she arrives, they have dinner, and then she sits at a desk facing away from him to read into this tape recorder.
While her back is turned, completely defenseless, Sagawa raises a .22 caliber rifle and shoots her in the back of the neck.
It is the ultimate act of cowardice. He knew he could never overpower her physically in a direct, face-to-face confrontation. He had to orchestrate a scenario where she was entirely vulnerable and unaware.
And I really want to pause here and push back on a narrative that sometimes surrounds cases like this. The idea of a sudden snap.
The crime of passion defense.
Right, a momentary lapse into madness where a person just loses control. The evidence from the sources shows a level of chilling, methodical premeditation that totally contradicts the idea of an impulsive frenzy.
Absolutely.
Like, he didn't just grab a heavy object in the heat of the moment. He went out and purchased that specific rifle in advance.
He bought 2 large suitcases before she even arrived.
Yes, he set up the tape recorder. He built a highly engineered trap.
I agree completely. The timeline proves deliberate executive functioning. He was executing a multi-step plan.
But then, right after he pulls the trigger, we get this bizarre detail. He faints.
Yes.
He builds the trap, he executes the plan, and the moment the reality of the violence actually hits him, he passes out cold.
It's such a staggering contradiction.
It really is. You have this grandiose, terrifying internal fantasy of being a dominant predator. But his physical reality is so pathetic that his nervous system literally shuts down at the sight of the blood he just spilled.
It perfectly highlights that massive chasm between the psychological fantasy and the physiological reality.
Right.
In his mind, he was committing this act of powerful assimilation. In reality, he had just brutally murdered a woman in his living room, and the visceral horror of it temporarily short-circuited his brain.
Unfortunately for everyone, he wakes up.
He does.
And once he regains consciousness, he realizes he has crossed the point of no return. And he just proceeds to enact the nightmare he'd been planning for years.
The details he later provided in his own confessions are profoundly disturbing.
They're awful.
He initially engaged in necrophilia, and following that, he attempted to bite directly into her flesh.
But he found out human teeth aren't really built for that.
Right, they aren't designed to easily pierce intact skin.
And this is another moment of cold calculation, right? Instead of giving up in a panic, what does he do? He leaves the apartment.
He leaves the body of his victim on the floor.
He goes out to a local store, and he purchases a butcher knife.
Yes. It demonstrates that the fainting spell didn't actually deter his overall objective. He encountered a physical obstacle, and he systematically acquired a tool to bypass it.
So over the next 3 days, he dismembered and consumed parts of her body.
And his descriptions, which he gleefully shared with the media later on, are just sickeningly clinical.
They really are. He noted the color of her fat, calling it corn-colored.
He claimed the flesh was entirely odorless and that it melted in his mouth.
He actually compared it to eating premium raw tuna at a sushi restaurant.
He consumed some of it raw. He cooked other parts in a frying pan with mustard.
And while he was doing all this, he took dozens of photographs, like meticulously documenting the defilement.
He even played back the tape recording of her reading the German poetry while he ate.
It was the total objectification and consumption of another human life. He was savoring the realization of a delusion he had nurtured since childhood.
He genuinely believed he was finally absorbing the power he lacked. But, as we know, delusions cannot suspend the laws of nature. Reality rapidly intruded.
Right. He called it the end of the honeymoon, which is just a repulsive way to phrase it.
That's disgusting.
But the body began to decompose. The smell became an issue. He couldn't stay in that apartment forever.
So on June 13, 2 days after the murder, he executes the final part of his premeditated plan.
He packs her dismembered remains into those 2 suitcases he had bought beforehand. He calls a taxi and takes it to the Bois de Boulogne, which is this massive public park on the western edge of Paris.
And his plan was to walk deep into the park and dump the suitcases into a lake.
But here again, his physical weakness completely betrays him.
The suitcases were extraordinarily heavy.
Right, and he's this tiny, frail guy.
As he was struggling to carry them, sweating and visibly straining, he drew the attention of people in the park, including a jogger.
And the jogger approaches him, likely just out of curiosity or, to offer help, and Sagawa panics.
He dropped the suitcases in the brush and just ran away.
The jogger obviously checks the abandoned suitcases, discovers the absolute horror inside, and immediately calls the police.
And because Sagawa had called a taxi to his own apartment, the police traced the drop-off location right back to 10 Rue Erlanger.
It was that easy. A couple of days later, they raid the apartment, they find the remaining body parts in his refrigerator, they find the rifle, they find the photographs.
And when they confront him, he doesn't even try to lie.
Not at all. He just looks at them and says, "I killed her to eat her flesh."
He was caught in the most indisputable manner possible.
So as a layperson looking at this, you hear all this and you think, okay, the system works, it's an awful tragedy, but the killer is caught. He confessed. The evidence is ironclad. Case closed, lock him up, throw away the key.
You would hope so.
Right. But this is where the story derails into something completely infuriating. The jogger calling the police wasn't the end of the story. It was literally the beginning of one of the most catastrophic legal failures in modern history.
The French loophole, as the sources call it.
Yes. Let's dive into the mechanics of that. I need you to explain to me, how does a man with a full confession, caught with the physical evidence, avoid a prison sentence?
Well, the unraveling begins almost immediately within the French legal and psychiatric framework.
Okay.
Upon his arrest, Sagawa was placed in a French jail to await trial. But because of the bizarre and gruesome nature of the crime, the court mandated psychological evaluations.
Makes sense.
So over the course of his detention, he was examined by multiple leading French psychiatrists.
And what were they looking for specifically? Like, what's the legal threshold there?
They were trying to determine his legal culpability based on the French Penal Code of the era, specifically Article 64, which deals with criminal responsibility.
Okay, Article 64.
In French law, if a person commits a crime while suffering from a psychological state that entirely abolishes their discernment or control over their actions, they cannot be held criminally liable.
So the insanity defense.
Yes. The judge overseeing the case, Jean-Louis Bruguière, reviewed the psychiatric reports and concluded that Sagawa was suffering from a severe reality-distorting psychosis.
Wow.
The court formally declared him legally insane.
Okay, let's unpack legally insane. That doesn't mean he just gets to go home.
Yeah.
Right. It means the state recognizes he committed the act, but believes his brain was so broken he couldn't form the legal intent required for murder.
Correct. When a French court rules a defendant legally insane, they are deemed unfit to stand trial. The criminal proceedings are essentially halted and dropped.
So they just drop the charges.
Yes, and the individual is removed from the jurisdiction of the penal system and transferred to the jurisdiction of the medical system.
Okay, so he becomes a patient, not an inmate.
Exactly. Sagawa was remanded to the Paul Guerreau Asylum, which is a secure psychiatric facility, for an indefinite period.
And what did the doctors there say?
3 separate psychiatrists evaluated him there and formally stated that his condition was incurable and that he would likely need confinement for the rest of his life.
Okay, so he's not in a traditional prison, but he is locked in a secure medical facility indefinitely. If the story ended right there, it wouldn't really be a failure of justice. It would just be the system operating as designed.
True.
But the system doesn't operate in a vacuum. It operates under public scrutiny. And the French public, quite understandably, loses their minds over this.
The outrage was massive. The details of the cannibalism had leaked to the press, and the story was heavily sensationalized.
I mean, how could it not be?
Right. And the French populace looked at the situation and saw this wealthy foreign national who had come to their country, slaughtered a European student in the most horrific way imaginable, and essentially escaped prison.
And even worse, from the public's perspective, French taxpayers were now footing the bill for his specialized medical care and his indefinite housing in a state asylum.
The political pressure on the French authorities must have been immense.
Oh, I'm sure. They have an incredibly unpopular, very expensive patient that they can't put on trial and can't easily cure.
And this is exactly when Akira Sagawa, the wealthy father, senses an opening.
Of course he does.
Akira Sagawa utilized his vast resources to hire elite legal counsel in France. He began lobbying the authorities, proposing a solution that would relieve the French government of their political and financial headache.
Let me guess. He wants him back in Japan.
The proposal was simple: extradite Issei Sagawa back to Japan. But the explicit promise was that he would not be set free.
Right.
He would merely be transferred to a Japanese psychiatric institution to continue his indefinite confinement closer to his family at his family's expense.
So France gets to wash their hands of him, save the money, stop the public outcry, and the father gets his son back on home soil.
It sounds like a diplomatic win-win.
So in 1984, 3 years after the murder, Sagawa's flown back to Tokyo. He is immediately admitted to the Matsuzawa Psychiatric Hospital. But this transfer is the exact moment the trapdoor opens.
It really is.
Because what happens when the Japanese doctors evaluate him?
The Japanese psychiatric evaluation at Matsuzawa Hospital yielded a fundamentally different diagnosis than the French evaluation.
How different?
After extensive interviews and testing, the Japanese medical professionals unanimously concluded that Issei Sagawa was completely sane.
I have to stop you. How is that medically possible?
It's a clash of medical cultures.
How do leading psychiatrists in Paris look at a man who ate a woman and say, he is totally disconnected from reality, 100% psychotic? And a few years later, leading psychiatrists in Tokyo look at the exact same man with the exact same history and say, nope, his brain functions perfectly fine.
Yeah.
Are they looking at different criteria?
Yes, they are viewing the pathology through entirely different cultural and diagnostic lenses.
Okay, explain that.
The French psychiatrists interpreted the act of cannibalism itself as prima facie evidence of a psychotic break.
Like the act is so crazy, you must be crazy.
Exactly. They believed the sheer extremity of the act indicated a mind that had lost all contact with reality. However, the Japanese psychiatrists took a more granular diagnostic approach.
What were they looking at?
They evaluated his cognitive function, his memory, his ability to plan, and his understanding of cause and effect.
Oh, the premeditation.
Right. They noted that he meticulously planned the murder. He bought the gun, he bought the suitcases, and he tried to hide the evidence.
Okay, I see where this is going.
A person experiencing a complete psychotic break, like a severe schizophrenic episode where they hallucinate that the victim is a literal demon, usually lacks the executive function to meticulously clean a crime scene and hire a taxi to dispose of evidence.
Because he tried to cover it up, he proved he knew it was wrong.
Precisely. The Japanese doctors concluded he was not suffering from a reality-distorting psychosis. Instead, they diagnosed him with a severe paraphilia, a profound, deep-seated sexual perversion.
So he's twisted, but not insane.
In their medical opinion, his urges were monstrous and evil, but they were not the result of insanity. He knew what he was doing, he knew it was illegal, and he chose to do it anyway to satisfy an erotic compulsion. Therefore, medically speaking, he was sane.
Okay, so the Japanese doctors say he's sane, he's a criminal, not a patient. So the Matsuzawa hospital administrators say, great, he's not our problem, and they call the Tokyo police to come arrest him for murder.
Right. They couldn't. This is where the bureaucratic firewall slammed shut. Because the Japanese doctors declared him sane under Japanese medical law, they had no legal justification to hold him in a psychiatric ward against his will.
Wait, you cannot indefinitely confine a sane person in a hospital.
Right.
But he committed a murder.
Yes, but he committed the murder in France. And this is where the concept of double jeopardy and international privacy laws create a catastrophic blind spot.
Okay, explain double jeopardy to me in this context, because I am genuinely confused by this part.
It's tricky.
My understanding of double jeopardy is that you cannot be tried twice for the same crime. Like, if a jury finds you not guilty, the state can't just keep bringing you back to court until they get a conviction.
That's generally correct.
But Sagawa was never tried. The French judge deemed him unfit. There was no jury, there was no verdict. How does double jeopardy apply to a trial that never even happened?
It's a fantastic question, and it really speaks to the nuance of how different legal systems interface.
Okay.
In the French system, Judge Bruguière's ruling under Article 64 wasn't just a pause in the proceedings, it was a final legal determination.
Oh, I see.
The court formally dropped the criminal charges based on the insanity finding. In the eyes of the French state, the criminal case was legally closed.
So when Japan looked at it,
When Japan looked at the situation, they recognized that a foreign sovereign court had already processed the case and reached a final legal conclusion. International legal norms generally discourage one country from entirely ignoring the finalized legal rulings of another country regarding the same event.
right, that causes diplomatic chaos.
But more practically, the Japanese prosecutors had a massive evidentiary problem.
They didn't have the gun, they didn't have the photos, they didn't have the body.
Exactly. All the physical evidence, all the witness statements, the original confession, it all belonged to the French authorities.
So the Japanese prosecutors must have contacted the French Justice Department and said, hey, our doctors found him sane. We want to charge him with murder here in Japan. Please send us the police files and the court records.
They did.
And France said no.
France absolutely refused.
Why?
Their reasoning was based on strict adherence to medical privacy laws. Remember, the French court had legally categorized Sagawa not as a criminal, but as a psychiatric patient.
Oh my God.
Under French law, the records of a psychiatric patient are strictly confidential. The French authorities informed Japan that sharing Sagawa's files would violate his right to medical privacy.
I am practically pulling my hair out right now. Let me see if I have the exact mechanics of this nightmare straight.
Go ahead.
France says he is insane, so we are closing the criminal case and opening a medical file. Japan says he is sane, so we are closing the medical file, but we need the criminal evidence to prosecute.
Right.
France responds, we can't give you the criminal evidence because it's technically a medical file, and that's private.
You've got it exactly right.
It's like two massive, sophisticated computer networks that are completely incompatible. France puts up an impenetrable firewall to protect patient privacy. Japan's operating system rejects the insane file format they were handed.
Yes.
And because the two systems refuse to communicate or find a workaround, the deadliest virus imaginable just quietly slips right out the back door.
That analogy perfectly captures the absurdity and the tragedy of the situation. It is the ultimate blind spot in international law.
It's just staggering.
The protocols designed to protect the human rights of the mentally ill, combined with strict national sovereignty over legal evidence, inadvertently manufactured a get-out-of-jail-free card for a confessed murderer.
The result of this systemic bureaucratic paralysis is a specific date that should just live in infamy. August 12th, 1986.
Yes.
Just a little over 5 years after he murdered and cannibalized Renée Hartevelt, Issei Sagawa simply packed his bags and checked himself out of the Matsuzawa Psychiatric Hospital.
He literally just left.
He walked out the front doors, stepped onto the streets of Tokyo, and he was a completely free man. He wasn't on parole. He wasn't under psychiatric supervision. His slate was entirely clean.
A failure at every conceivable level of institutional oversight. And unfortunately, the tragedy doesn't end with his freedom.
Or gets worse.
What he did with that freedom reveals a deeply disturbing facet of our society's relationship with violence.
Which brings us to the third part of this story, the celebrity monster. If you or I, or any normal person, somehow found a loophole and escaped a life sentence for a heinous crime, the psychological weight of that would crush us.
You would want it to disappear.
You would change your names, you would move to a cabin in the woods, you would spend the rest of your life trying to be invisible out of sheer shame.
But Sagawa possessed no such shame.
None.
His narcissism, the very thing that drove him to kill in order to feel powerful, recognized a new opportunity. He realized that his infamy made him unique.
He leaned into it.
In a perverse way, the murder finally gave him the status he had always craved. He didn't hide from his monstrousness, he commodified it.
He turned himself into a brand. He monetized his own atrocity. The output detailed in the source material is genuinely nauseating. He became a minor celebrity in Japan.
He wrote over 20 books.
Over 20. And we must emphasize, these were not obscure, self-published rants that sat in a basement.
No, his most famous book, In the Fog, or Kiri no Naka, in Japanese, was a detailed, self-aggrandizing account of the murder.
And it was picked up by major publishers.
Yes, and it reportedly sold hundreds of thousands of copies. He was actively profiting, massively, from the detailed recounting of Renée Hartevelt's death.
He didn't just stop at his own crime either. He positioned himself as a public intellectual on the topic of murder.
Which is just bizarre.
He wrote a book called Shonen A, which was his commentary on the 1997 Kobe child murders, where a 14-year-old boy killed younger children. The media actually paid Issei Sagawa, a cannibal, to provide expert psychological analysis on another killer.
His integration into the pop culture was shockingly broad. He drew and published a manga, a comic book version of his crime.
Unbelievable.
He took up painting, specifically creating and selling nude portraits of Caucasian women, directly channeling his deadly obsession into art that people were willing to purchase.
He even crossed over into film. In 1992, he appeared in an exploitation movie called The Bedroom, directed by Hisayasu Sato.
And his role wasn't just a cameo.
No. He played a sadosexual voyeur. He was literally playing a heightened, fictionalized version of his own depravity for the entertainment of a paying audience.
The infamy resonated globally, too. The international true crime consciousness absorbed him. In 1983, the Rolling Stones released a song called Too Much Blood, which explicitly referenced Sagawa and the broader desensitization to violence in the media.
I remember that.
The Stranglers wrote a song titled Loophole based on his story. He became a reference point, a dark meme before the internet era.
But of all the details in the sources, there's one that I think represents the absolute rock bottom of this entire media circus. It is the peak of surreal, morbid irony.
The magazine.
Issei Sagawa was hired by a Japanese magazine called Spa to write restaurant reviews.
Yes, they employed a confessed cannibal as a food critic.
It is so crass, so grotesquely on the nose, that if you pitched it in a satirical movie script, executives would reject it for being too unbelievable. They would say, audiences won't buy that society is that broken. Yet it happened.
It reveals a profound truth about the media ecosystem of the late 80s and 90s, and arguably today.
Oh, definitely today.
Sagawa had no conventional marketable skills. He was frail, he couldn't hold down a normal corporate job, and as we'll discuss, his family's wealth wasn't infinite. His identity as a murderer was his only currency.
But here is the vital economic reality. A currency is only valuable if there is a market willing to accept it.
Exactly. The magazine editors who hired him as a food critic knew exactly what they were doing.
They weren't hiring him for his palate.
No, they were hiring him for the shock value. They knew people would buy the magazine just to read what the cannibal thought of the local steakhouse.
The media cannibalized his story for ratings, for circulation numbers, and for profit. And Sagawa, in a dark symbiotic loop, cannibalized the media right back to sustain his livelihood.
It was an ecosystem built entirely on the foundation of Renée Hartevelt's tragedy.
Looking at the retrospective sources like the public comment sections on the 2015 Japan Today article, you can see that a lot of people were deeply disgusted by this. Yeah, reading those comments is actually a bit of a relief because it shows that the general public hasn't entirely lost its moral compass. One commenter explicitly called his freedom and celebrity a shameful blemish on Japanese society.
And you have to consider the unimaginable pain of Renée Hartevelt's family.
I can't even fathom it.
They didn't just lose their brilliant daughter in a horrific act of violence. They were forced to endure decades of watching her killer thrive. Every time he published a book, every time he went on a talk show, every time he reviewed a restaurant, it was a public desecration of her memory.
The comments also brought up a really fascinating point regarding xenophobia and cultural double standards. Several commenters argued very convincingly that if the situation were reversed, if a tall, white European man had murdered and cannibalized a young Japanese woman in Tokyo and then walked free on a technicality, the national outrage in Japan would have been apocalyptic.
There would have been riots.
There would be no talk show appearances.
It's a highly valid sociological observation. Because the crime occurred on the other side of the planet, in Paris, to a foreign national, there was a vast psychological and geographical distance.
Out of sight, out of mind.
Right. The Japanese media and public were able to treat the story not as a visceral domestic tragedy that demanded moral accountability, but almost as a bizarre, morbid export. It was a dark curiosity from a faraway place, which lowered the barrier to treating it as entertainment.
But I want to challenge the listener right now and challenge this entire true crime framework we are operating in. It's very easy for us to point fingers at Sagawa. He's the monster. It's easy to point fingers at the judge in France or the doctors in Japan. They are the broken system. It's even easy to blame the magazine editors who hired him.
But there's another piece to the puzzle.
Right. Aren't the consumers just as complicit? What about the hundreds of thousands of people who walked into a bookstore, took money out of their wallets, and bought his book?
The audience.
What about the people who tuned in to watch him on television? By buying the manga, by feeding his infamy, wasn't the audience just feeding his ego in the exact same way he physically fed on his victim? Where is the line between morbid curiosity and actively funding the glorification of a killer?
That is the central, uncomfortable question of the true crime genre. When does observation tip over into exploitation?
It's a blurry line.
Sagawa, as a narcissist, recognized that society possesses a deeply ingrained dark appetite for the macabre. He served them exactly what they craved, and they eagerly consumed it. The consumers provided the financial demand that allowed him to live a comfortable, privileged life for decades after the murder. The market dictated his survival.
The markets crash, and biological realities always catch up. Let's move to the final chapter of his life, because this story does not end with Issei Sagawa reigning as a wealthy celebrity icon. Let's look at how the facade crumbled.
Time and biology eventually accomplished what the international justice system completely failed to do.
Yes, they did.
As Sagawa aged into his 50s and 60s, the media's morbid fascination with him waned. He was no longer the shocking news of the day. He became a tired relic of a bygone scandal.
The book deals dried up.
The talk show invitations stopped.
A major turning point came in 2005. His parents, the absolute bedrock of his survival, passed away.
Akira Sagawa, the powerful patriarch who had bought his freedom, died. And the extent to which Issei had alienated his family became starkly apparent.
Yeah, according to reports, he was entirely barred from attending his parents' funeral.
The ultimate excommunication from the dynasty he was supposed to inherit.
And whatever wealth was left in the estate was rapidly depleted. Sagawa used the remaining inheritance to pay off his parents' accrued creditors. When the dust settled, the trust fund was gone. The celebrity money was gone.
He was left virtually destitute.
He was forced to move to a tiny, state-subsidized public housing apartment in Kawasaki City, relying entirely on modest welfare benefits to buy food and pay rent.
That is a staggering fall from grace.
From a wealthy heir dining in Paris to a pariah living on state handouts in a cramped apartment. But his physical decline was even more dramatic than his financial ruin. In November 2013, at the age of 64, Sagawa suffered a cerebral infarction, a severe stroke.
The stroke was devastating. It caused permanent, irreversible damage to his nervous system.
He lost the ability to walk, right?
Yes, he was permanently confined to a wheelchair. He lost the ability to perform basic motor functions. He required intense daily assistance just to manage his bodily needs, which was provided by visiting state caregivers and his younger brother.
This brings us to a really incredible piece of source material. In 2015, 2 years after the stroke, a journalist from Japan Today managed to secure an interview with him. He is 65 years old, frail, wheelchair-bound and living in squalor.
And the interviewer asks him about his current mindset, assuming he must be tormented.
Right, but Sagawa expresses this incredibly bizarre, eerie tranquility.
He told the interviewer that he found simple things like the sun radiating through the trees to be, quote, pretty.
Which is such a normal thing to say, but so weird coming from him.
He articulated that for his entire life, from childhood through his adulthood, his brain had been a war zone, tormented by the agonizing contradiction of, I want to eat it, battling against the societal reality of eating it is forbidden.
But now, in his physically shattered state, he claimed that the war was over. He felt peaceful.
But then he drops a bombshell that completely contradicts his entire literary career.
Yes. In The Fog, the book that made him rich, he wrote pages and pages of prose about how delicious human flesh was, describing it as the ultimate transcendent culinary experience.
But in this 2015 interview, he looks at the journalist and says that was all a lie.
He claims human flesh actually wasn't that good. He says he had just obsessed over the idea of cannibalism for so long, built it up in his head for decades, that he had to convince himself it tasted amazing to justify what he had done.
He literally tells the reporter, I'd much rather eat Matsuzaka beef, Kobe beef.
It is a stunning admission. If true, it completely obliterates the mythos he spent decades building. He wasn't a sophisticated, dark connoisseur of forbidden acts. He was a delusional man who committed an unspeakable horror for a fantasy that didn't even taste good.
He also addresses his current desires in that interview. He mentions watching a morning TV soap opera and seeing a young actress on screen. He says he'd catch a glimpse of her thigh and the thought would cross his mind, that sure looks tasty.
But he quickly clarifies that the thought possessed no urgency. He claimed he has no actual desire to ever act on it again.
And his reasoning is fascinating in a very grim way. He said, as I accomplish the act of cannibalism once, there's no meaning to maintaining the desire for it anymore.
It's a chillingly transactional view of human life. He views Renée Hartevelt not as a person he destroyed, but simply as a goal he achieved. He ticked the box on his dark bucket list, so the compulsion faded.
With the overarching consuming obsession gone, his final goals in life became remarkably, almost pathetically mundane.
Like going to a bookstore.
Yes. In that same interview, he stated that his only remaining ambitions were to recover enough physical strength to take a trip to the Shinjuku branch of the Kinokuniya bookstore, browse some books, and then go to a restaurant to eat grilled eel.
He never made it to the bookstore. Issei Sagawa remained in his wheelchair, requiring constant care for another 7 years. He contracted pneumonia and died in a Tokyo hospital on November 24, 2022. He was 73 years old.
A very quiet end to a very loud, horrific life.
I have to ask you for your expert opinion on those late-in-life confessions. Claiming he preferred Kobe beef, claiming the compulsion was cured just because he did it once. Do you think those were moments of genuine, clear-eyed reflection from an old man facing death? Or was it just a final, desperate attempt by a fading narcissist to say something shocking enough to get his name back in the headlines one last time?
When analyzing a psychopathic personality, it's very difficult to separate truth from manipulation. It is entirely possible it was the latter.
He knew how to play the media.
Exactly. He was deeply aware of media dynamics. He knew that a journalist doesn't want a boring answer. Reversing his stance on the taste of human flesh is a highly provocative hook.
But could there be a physical reason?
Yes, there is also a physiological argument. The physical reality of a massive stroke, combined with the natural decline of aging, severely alters brain chemistry and hormone levels. It is plausible that the neurological damage genuinely stripped away the intense, eroticized energy that had fueled his delusions for 50 years.
Like the engine just died.
When the physical body completely fails, the grandiosity of the mind often collapses with it. The engine that drove the obsession was broken.
Either way, when you look at the entire arc of his life, the irony of his ending is profound and bitter. Think back to the psychological driver we discussed in the beginning, Zufigia. He committed the ultimate act of violation, slaughtering and consuming a brilliant young woman, specifically because he wanted to absorb her energy.
He wanted to consume power.
He wanted to ingest her vitality to overcome his own lifelong physical weakness and inadequacy.
Yes. And yet, he ended his life entirely powerless. He absorbed nothing of lasting value. He spent his final decade frail, broken by a stroke, unable to walk, and utterly reliant on the mercy and physical labor of others just to survive from one day to the next.
He destroyed a promising life, caused incalculable pain, and ended up exactly as weak and pathetic as he had always feared he was.
It's a fitting end, in a way.
So what does this all mean? As we bring this deep dive to a close, we have to look at the totality of what we just explored. The story of Issei Sagawa is a terrifying intersection of catastrophic failures. It is the story of a monstrous psychological delusion that was shielded and enabled by extreme wealth and privilege.
It is a damning case study of how rigid, isolated legal and medical bureaucracies, systems designed to uphold justice and protect privacy, can inadvertently create a loophole large enough for a confessed killer to walk through.
And perhaps most uncomfortably, it is an indictment of the darkest impulses of media consumption. Understanding the mechanics of this case, how the legal paradox functioned, why the diagnostic criteria clashed, and how the market demanded his celebrity is so much more important than just gawking at the horrific details of the crime itself.
Absolutely. Because while the exact legal circumstances of the French and Japanese systems have evolved since 1981, the underlying vulnerabilities remain.
Wealth still buys unequal justice.
Bureaucracies still fail to communicate, and the media still profits immensely from the sensationalization of violence.
Which brings me to a final, lingering thought I want to leave with you. We are currently living in the absolute golden age of true crime. Everywhere you look, there are podcasts, high-budget documentaries, and streaming series dissecting the worst days of people's lives.
It's everywhere.
So where exactly is the line? Where is the boundary between genuinely seeking to understand the psychology of evil or the failures of the justice system, and inadvertently turning monsters into stars? The next time you click on a sensational true crime story or buy a book written by someone adjacent to a tragedy, ask yourself who is really profiting from the consumption of this trauma. Are we, as an audience, seeking justice and understanding? Or are we just hungry for the details?
Something to really think about.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. It is heavy, unsettling history, but examining these systemic failures is the only way we learn to recognize them. Stay curious, stay critical, and we will catch you on the next deep dive.